Yes, you're welcome once again to our series of Book Chat. And today we'll be talking with Professor Gail Presbey. She is a professor of philosophy and chair of the philosophy department. She's also an affiliated faculty of the history department, affiliated faculty Women's and Gender Studies program, University of Detroit Mercy, College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences. Professor Presby, you're welcome to Book Chat.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Holly, for having me on your series.
Good. Well, the usual question I always like to start with that, in my opinion, every published book has a backstory. And the backstory sometimes does not make it into the book. And I know you tried very much to include in your acknowledgement some parts of the story. Please, could you tell us the story behind this book? What made you want to write it and what made you write it?
Well, I just feel so fortunate to have gotten to know Professor Oruka, and I spent some time with him in the mid-90s. I was interested in his Sage Philosophy project. And that all started because I was interested in African philosophy. And I happened to be in graduate school at Fordham University when Emmanuel Eze was also in graduate school, same time as me. And he's the one who told me about African philosophy, that he was doing work in that because really it wasn't part of our curriculum. And so he got me interested in African philosophy. I started going to conferences, and it was Lucius Outlaw who I met, who I knew seeing him at several conferences. And I told him, I really want to learn more about African philosophy. How should I do it? He's an African American philosopher who had worked for years, for decades, to bring together African American and African philosophers for an exchange of ideas and for cross continent solidarity. I do talk about some of that in my 8th chapter. But so Lucius Outlaw said straight away, you should go to Kenya and you should meet Henry Oruka. And he's the one doing this exciting work these days. So I did, and I went, and I mean, the story of how I started was really like I wrote letters and said I'm coming and never heard anything, and I dared to show up anyway. It's one of those things. And the whole department knew I was coming, but somehow hadn't written me. Back in the mid-90s, we didn't have this lightning speed communication like we're used to now. And Professor Ruka said, oh, I knew you were coming, and I had your letter, but it was in my car, and my car was broken into, and I lost my papers, and I didn't know how to contact you. One of those stories. But as
Mhm.
soon as we uh, were there in person together, he was really so helpful to me, shared all his publications with me, was happy to find someone who was interested in learning African philosophy and about his Sage Philosophy project. And he said straight away that I should come and stay for a year. And he also said, and he would like to come and visit the US for a year. So at first we had this exchange set up, but it didn't work out the first time we tried it because University of Nairobi, there was a big strike and they couldn't do any exchanges during the strike. But the following year, the strike was over. 95, 96 is the first year I was able to come. And so
Mm.
I did work with him then and uh, came uh, it was very good. We went out and we interviewed sages, and I was supposed to come for the fall semester, which I did. And winter semester, he was supposed to be guest lecturer at my university in the U.S. But then he he died. He got hit by a vehicle, killed in a crash in December 95. He was in his early 50s and like 51 years old. It was very stressful for everyone. So there I was ending up at his funeral. And everyone was going, what's going to happen now? He had so much important work he was doing. And now he's gone. And he was so central to African philosophy. So that's when I decided to come back. And so I came back for 2 years to University of Nairobi. I was a Fulbright scholar. So I want to thank the Fulbright program for helping me, but also the University of Nairobi Philosophy Department. They were so helpful to me, helping me with my stay. And friends of Odera Oruka's, including Chungo Barasa, who had helped Odera Oruka interview sages in the first place, he agreed to continue taking me out to interview sages so we could continue doing sage philosophy. And it was this warm welcome that is part of the backstory of the
Okay.
book.
All right. I mean, that was a very expansive backstory, and I'm sure that these are the kind of things that will probably motivate people to want to read the book titled The Life and Thought of H. Odera Oruka, Pursuing Justice in Africa. And it's published by Bloomsbury Publishers in 2023. Oruka's concept of sage philosophy is central to this work. And as usual, you know, with AI generative app, it was possible to know that the idea of sage philosophy came up 133 times in the book. How do you see this concept contributing to the contemporary philosophical discourse, particularly in the context of decolonizing knowledge and fostering inclusive intellectual traditions? One more question. What are some of the potential challenges or criticisms of this approach, and how might Oruka respond to them?
Okay. So, I mean, Professor Oruka, he started the whole Sage Philosophy Project very much in the context of trying to decolonize knowledge. When he came back from his studies abroad, he studied in both Sweden and Detroit, where I'm located, for his master's and PhD. When he came back to University of Nairobi, already Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Taban Lo and so many people in the English department were already challenging. Why do we have this, Kenya has its independence, it's the 1970s, and yet we're studying nothing but the Europeans, the British, etc. And that was true in philosophy as well. And so Odera Oruka really took that to heart. And one of the folks who was at University of Nairobi then was Okoth Pigatek. And he was also saying, the Europeans don't understand Africa. They misunderstand things. They have an outsider perspective. And so it's in this context that Odera Oruka felt like he needed to start the Sage Philosophy Project. Now, as I try to clarify in my book, it's not like he only thought this up in the mid-70s, because I argue that as a child and as a young man, he had firsthand experience of this philosophizing that went on in his rural village and with his father and his father's friends. And in fact, in his sage philosophy book, he does include his own father as a sage. So really, he had been experiencing and caring about African philosophy, his whole life. But when he came back in the 1970s is when he realized that curriculums had to change. Mm-hmm. And he noticed some of those challenges even when he was at Uppsala. It was very interesting. At Uppsala, there was, in Sweden, there was this emphasis on analytic philosophy, logical positivism. And the students had protests and said, we want to read Fanon, we want to read Marx, we want to read all these authors. And based on that, Ingemar Hedenius, who had been Oruka's dissertation advisor, based on that, he offered those courses for the first time, existentialism, Fanon. And so Adair Oruka had seen how there could be a movement to reform the curriculum at Uppsala. And when he came to Nairobi, saw Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he just realized that the philosophy department at Nairobi also needed to be challenged. It needed more Kenyan faculty. But then he came up with sage philosophy, which is addressing the problem of text. Okay, if you're not just going to study the Europeans, what will be your philosophical texts? And so he said, we need to create our texts. Now, there are some historical philosophical texts in Africa. I don't want to say there are none. In fact, in 1976, in the mid-70s, he went to his first international philosophy conference, and he met Claude Sumner, a Jesuit who worked in Ethiopia, who had collected ancient texts from Ethiopia. So there are texts, but not enough. And Adair Oruka knew that there was this oral philosophizing going on, but he wasn't happy with anthropologists who might have done their interviews and then anonymize and compile everyone as into, this is how this group thinks, like overview, and then maybe seeming like there's no debate or dispute or there aren't individual thinkers. So he wanted to preserve the ideas of the individual thinkers, and he wanted them to be named, not anonymized. And so he went himself and he had his graduate students go out and do so many interviews, collect photographs, make biographies of each sage, include highlights from the sage recordings, interviews, and present it to first audience to Kenyans as a common heritage of Kenyans. And he talks about this in his book when he talks about creating a national culture. There was a tendency for people in Kenya to know the wise persons who come from their own ethnic group and their own rural area. But then if they ever made it to university, they wouldn't learn about the wise Kenyans from other parts of Africa. They would learn British or European philosophers. So he wanted to put them together to say, we should all learn from the wise sayings and ideas of all Kenyans. And so he had a wide array of people represented in his group, and he could partly do that because he sent out various interviewers and graduate students to different places in Kenya to do it. So it's all part of a decolonizing project. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say that Professor Olufemi Taiwo will not really agree with this whole idea of decolonizing knowledge. I mean, he says that it has almost become the point in which people are even going to decolonize boiling water, according to his defense against the concept of decolonization. What is it exactly, in your mind, is this idea of decolonizing knowledge, or the whole idea of epistemology that is not only Euro-American driven?
Okay, thanks a lot. Well, so there's the problem with colonizing knowledge is having too narrow a scope. So many philosophers would agree, and even scientists would agree, you want to have as many good sources as possible to make the most informed decision about life. And so just to have a narrowness is a problem philosophically. And then to have a hierarchy, a preordained hierarchy that is impacted perhaps by racism is another problem. In other words, some voices are dismissed from the start before their ideas are taken seriously. And so part of the decolonizing knowledge project is trying to counteract those tendencies and listen more seriously to a wide array of voices with an open mind and not just presuming they're wrong or they're backward or they're not as good as something we already have. A lot of times you can't see any shortcoming in your own view unless you ever challenge yourself to experience that view from a different perspective.
Well, the whole question of decolonization is a very interesting one. Even the concept of African philosophy has always been contentious to say, is there African philosophy or there's just philosophy? But I'm not going to go there right now. I know that in putting together any book, no matter what it is, but in your case, it looks as if yours is both a biography, but an academic biography. There's no doubt that you must have encountered challenges while doing that. So if you did, what were these challenges and how did you surmount them?
Okay, so part of it is anytime you're writing a book, you have to think of the scope because it can't go on and on. Although I do feel like I have enough to write maybe another 2 books, just things that I didn't already include. But so there's the scope, and I did decide I wanted it to be this intellectual biography because I wanted to show not just his ideas, but his ideas in context. So I wanted to tell a bit about him as well as his work and how he developed his ideas in response to current events and his own experiences, which were broadening all the time. So there's his rural life in Kenya, there's his time in Uppsala, there's his time in Wayne State, then he comes back as a professor in Nairobi, then he goes, for example, to Nigeria for a year's sabbatical. And then, he meets philosophers from around the world. He comes to the US and is a teacher at a couple of universities here, Earlham and others. And so I wanted to show how each time he has a new life experience, it shows itself in his work. So that's why I wanted it to be an intellectual biography. Now, philosophers aren't necessarily always trained to do history. I actually went back and got a history master's degree because I wanted to learn more sound historical method, not only for writing this book on Oruka, but also for understanding the interviews I was doing with sages. So part of the challenge was always educating myself on methodologies and reading about, what methodologies are the most sensitive and best for interviewing people, for portraying them in context. So, and I hope that's what I've been able to do with Adara Ruka. And so those are some of the challenges. Also, missing texts were part of the challenge. So other scholars had already reviewed all his published works, which are many. But I wanted to go beyond just the published works because I wanted to shed new light. And so I wanted to look at drafts. I wanted to look at MA and PhD theses, his licentiate at Uppsala, and I was able to do that. Correspondence with Ingemar Hedenius, his mentor, that is in the archive at Uppsala. And as I was reading, every so often, Oruka, he did write one autobiographical article, which was published, My Strange Way to Philosophy. And it does,
Mm,
of course, help when somebody's telling you their life story, but that was just one article. But he did make allusions in a couple of places to the idea that he was writing something much bigger. And so, oh, I looked everywhere. Nobody knew, nobody knew, nobody knew.
mm,
But and thank goodness to Tommy Zane, who was a very good friend of Adara Oruka's. They were graduate students at Uppsala together.
mm,
And Oruka had given a copy of this autobiographical novel to Tommy Zane for safekeeping. So now, not only for safekeeping, but also to get his advice on how to get it published. Because he had submitted it to a publisher, it was rejected, he wanted to improve it. So he asked Tommy, how can I improve it? And so Tommy had this. But another thing I did realize is many people had said, Odera Ruka would come to them and say, can you please hold on to these papers for
mm,
safekeeping? Because his house had been raided by the Kenyan police. He had had experiences like I said, things taken out of his car. He had had experiences that made him worried that politically he could be vulnerable. So many Kenyan academics were under all those years with President Moi, and he was nervous. And he would give people papers and say, please keep them for me.
mm.
So, I mean, that's a sad part of the story because it was a constant problem in his life, a constant worry in his life. But because of that, I we had this autobiographical novel finally located in Sweden,
Mm.
and Tommy also could tell me every person in this autobiographical novel, their name is changed, but I'll tell you who they really are because he knew, because he had talked to Aruka all about it. And so now when I mention that in my book, I say, it was a novel. It was a novel that Tommy Zane says, was very closely based on real people. And it was about his year in Nigeria. So
Mm.
uh, so it was very interesting. But those are some of the insights I could put into the book, from correspondence, from interviewing his colleagues who shared with me their memories of him. All of those things together, I wove them together to tell the story of the person and how his life experiences were challenging him to come up with certain art arguments, ethical arguments about what should be done in the world. His key values, his key insights uh, were all being affected. His idea of how philosophy should be taught, how the world
Mm.
should be changed. Those were based on those experiences.
Well, those are very interesting things, but you did mention the fact that part of the historiography was to use a fictional novel he wrote. In Nigeria, this genre came up called faction, where you use fiction and facts. And a person like late Professor Collier Motoshaw did come up with a book on faction. But let's leave that and quickly go
To
to,
clarify that I
yes,
did not blend these things together without telling the reader what was going on.
yeah.
So my book where I talk about his life, this is the best, to the best of my knowledge, what happened. And when I talk about this autobiographical novel, I let the reader know and I let them know the theory. And then what I did is every place in the novel. So I don't have stake as to whether every detail in there really happened to him. But what I show is that the main character, who could very well be himself or a
Mhm.
protagonist like himself, he describes himself having scenarios, and the main character says, and because of this, we have to do this in the world for these reasons. And then I footnote straight to a philosophy journal article where he made the same arguments.
I see.
So what I'm saying is, in the novel, he shows how life experiences are giving rise to philosophical insights, and they're the same philosophical insights he writes about in a completely other genre, the genre of philosophy academic work. So he writes in that genre and comes to the same conclusions. And that's what I think is so interesting philosophically about it. But I'm not trying to blend in fiction when I'm talking about his life. I try to be very careful.
Okay. Well, we wouldn't let this draw for too long. And Oruka was not just an academic, but also an activist and public intellectual, like you've described. How did his engagement with the real world issues, such as the struggle for democracy in Kenya, shape his philosophical thinking? How did he balance his theoretical work with practical commitments in a very short, brief response?
Not like my others. Okay, I'll try to be brief. Well, for example, his first book, Punishment and Terrorism in Africa. This is where he writes about how there were so many countries in Africa where authoritarian leaders were using draconian punishments in inhumane conditions. So he was always someone who advocated for an end to the death penalty. He wanted fairness and justice, an end to political imprisonment, and also an end to very high sentences for the poor who might be stealing something for their survival. And he talked a lot about how that was not in the African tradition as well. So there was a key issue on which one of the first things he wrote about as a philosopher was something he was concerned about and wanted to advocate for a change in the world. And he also wrote about environmental ethics. He was very concerned about destruction of the environment. He thought the environment had value. He was very happy the first time he went to this international conference that someone there was speaking on environmental ethics. And he came back to Kenya, very interested in that because I guess up to that point, he hadn't heard philosophers debate it. And it became a key theme for him. And in fact, it was the theme of a big conference that he hosted in 1991 in Kenya, where philosophers from around the world came to address those issues. So he was very interested in the rich-poor gap in the world. And he fought against this Garrett Hardin idea of lifeboat ethics, this idea of the poor should just sink so the rich countries can rise. And he talked about the indebtedness of rich nations to poor nations and the need for reform of this way that the international economy is run. And he would put articles in the newspaper meant for Kenyan audiences too, when he thought there was a breach of authority, when he thought there were civil servants who didn't care for the Kenyan people. He would do critiques of those. He spoke out on those kind of issues in the newspapers, which is not the case for every academic philosopher, but that's what he did.
Interesting. Well, our viewers, we're still on Book Chat, and the book we're chatting about today is The Life and Thought of H. Odera Oruka, Pursuing Justice in Africa. Justice is a very philosophical question because I don't think there would be a general definition of what justice is. But he was pursuing justice. What in his mind was this thing called justice? How do you think he would have defined justice?
Okay, so now that you mentioned it, so justice was a big philosophical topic during the time of Oruka. And there was a very famous book, John Rawls, who wrote A Theory of Justice, and Oruka read Rawls and then thought Rawls had his priorities wrong, because he was worried that the way Rawls defined justice, and Rawls would say things like, a rich-poor gap is okay as long as everybody is better off, something like that. And Oruka did not agree. He thought this gap had to be reduced. And this is what he would argue. He goes, well, what if, and he used a lot of philosophers like to use these thought experiments. He goes, what if there's a new medical technology that can help people to extend their lives, extra 100 years or something, but it's very expensive. And only some people can afford to extend their lives that long. But it doesn't shorten anyone else's life. Would there be no injustice in that? He was worried that Rawls's definition of justice would allow something like that. And he goes, well, that would be an injustice if some people, because of money, got to live twice as long. And then he would say, that's going on right now. He'd say, that's not really just a thought experiment, because poverty is like drastically reducing the lifespans of people. And other people live longer because they're richer. And, and so he would do that. And he had a lot of other thought experiments like that. And not just critiquing the international community, the rich nations of the North, but also internally critiquing problems in Africa itself, because he thought African countries, especially the ones they had gained their own freedom from colonialism, he thought they could be doing a better job at providing these basic needs for people. So, but he would do it in an abstract way, because philosophers like to do that. And maybe he was also like trying to make sure he didn't just get pinned, for what he said. He goes, let's just imagine a country known by its acronym ARID, African Republic of Inhumanity and Death. And in this republic, these things happen. What would be wrong with it? So he liked to give these specific examples of this would be an injustice, And his punishment book uses the same kind of way. And every so often he has like a little flourish. He's making a point where I wonder, oh, did he just contradict his own definition of justice? He goes like, there should be no maltreatment of prisoners and no capital punishment, except maybe for Idi Amin or something. He would throw in something like that. I think that was just his, agitation about injustice. But in general, he was oftentimes trying to advocate for an idea of justice that avoided the problems, the vagueness of other definitions, or the lack of prioritizing equality, which was so important to him for justice.
Well, I would have loved us to continue and talk a little bit more about this man, but I need to end it on this note. What do you hope readers will take away from this biography of Oruka? What impact do you hope it will have on the study of African philosophy and the broader field of philosophy itself? The last one, what future research or scholarship do you hope this book inspires?
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, the last question first. I would love it if more people write books on Oruka. And anytime you publish a book, I have to wonder, are there going to be critics? The critics should write a better book, and then that would be a wonderful thing. I hope he gets more attention. But I do hope that because of this book, he'll be better known. Now, already among those who study African philosophy, he's known as one of the key proponents of African philosophy, along with Pauline Huntonji and Kwasi Wiredu, and so many of the first generation of African philosophers. And he knew them all, of course, and they did a lot of things together. So people really knew about Oruka. But so many people don't know about African philosophy. So you can be well known in African philosophy and still not known in the broader field of philosophy, which is a real shame. But I hope that more people in the field of philosophy will get interested in African philosophers. And if they do, Oruka is a great one to study because he not only did projects like Sage Philosophy directly addressing issues of what is African philosophy, but he did so much ethics and social and political philosophy as well. I mean, those are considered different branches of philosophy. He brings an African perspective to them. But if someone says, well, I've never really studied Africa. Oh, but you care about ethics, don't you? Oh, you care about social and political philosophy, don't you? You could learn from African philosophers about those issues.
Wow. Well, it's been said many times over and again that to live in the hearts of those who love you is not to die. Now, to live in a written, published book about a man who had concerns for the poor, had concerns about the earth, and had other concerns about justice and how justice should be pursued, such a man would live and live for a long time. Well, on that note, I would like to say a very big thank you to Professor Gail Presbey for taking the time to come on Book Chat. And we hope that at another time when you come up with a new book, we'll be able to talk to you again on the book. And just as a passing note, the name Oruka in the Yoruba language
Oh,
means ring, and
oh,
it's pronounced Oruka.
oh,
So, and I can see how the name of this man will ring on and on in the hearts of a lot of people. Thank you very much, Prof.
and
Until next time, we'll say thank you very much.
thank you so much for having me on your show. I really appreciate it.